Hi, Misha here, and we've been slowly but surely kind of working our way through various FN, FAL types, varieties, and the histories of the nations they've served in. And it's now finally time for Israel, the IDF. Israel, a nation that never has been and is not today at all controversial. Yeah. Now, in my recent M14 video, as a comparison to that rifle, which went up against the T-48 in American trials, I shot, well, not this exact Israeli FAL, this is the light barrels, but a parts kit assembled on a DS Arms. This is a pre-ban SBO receiver, which is actually FN. We'll get there eventually. And this would be the Israeli standard issue infantry rifle for about a quarter century. And they wanted something, well, they wanted a self-loading rifle that was modern. Problem is, they wanted this around 1953. Their options were rather limited. And to go along with it, they would ultimately also pick up its big brother, the FALO, F-A-L-O, to be an spot automatic support weapon, LMG, what have you. And Israel would be one of the few actual major users of this gun. This is on an M-Bell receiver, old Springfield. And in a lot of ways, the heavy barrels are more common than the light barrels in America. And I actually have quite a history with both guns, we'll get to as we share. And as prevalent as the Israeli FAL is, you know, the basic history is not all that long. Like, we don't just know just a whole lot about it. So we're going to dive in, just talk about how and why they selected this weapon, why it was both a good thing and a bad thing, and why this is basically my representative early FN FAL in my collection, and really one of the few early styles you could get in the pre-ban, so pre-1989 era. I don't know, we're just going to hang out today. It's a really pretty day out, and talk Israeli FALs, both the light barrel and the heavy. So if you'd like that, join us, like, share, subscribe, help out on Patreon if possible. If not, that's cool too. So let's go back to the post-World War II period and discuss, well, why and how FN Herstal created the FAL, and how the nation of Israel was created, and in some ways how they're both linked. If you're looking for a region, a conflict, a people that's clearly black and white, good guy, bad guy, don't look at the Middle East, not to mention Israel. It's been a hot potato since World War II, even long before. There were resistance fighters, partisans, and of course World War II extended to North Africa and the Middle East. That gets us to the Israeli Haganah, essentially a paramilitary underground force, 1944-1945. And there was a big push for an independent Israel. And it's actually debated to create an independent Palestinian state and an independent Israeli state in the nascent UN with American backing. The British have a big vested interest because they're essentially decolonizing, and that's one of the regions. Yeah, there's an arms embargo. Basically, they're trying to have peacekeepers there, but the Haganah is fighting Palestinians fighting the Haganah. They're all kind of sometimes popping off at the British peacekeeping forces. it's a no-win thing. And there is a big push to get weapons like this from Europe. Before the end of World War II, the Israelis took what they could get. They actually would end up with quite a few surplus soldiers from the British Jewish battalion that fought in World War II. There were also Jewish Americans that would end up there, French Foreign Legion Jewish folks, exiled folks from Germany. So there's a lot of combat experience, but they don't have a ton of ammunition and not a ton of guns. And what they do, it's a hodgepodge, a lot of Sten guns, infields, a lot of things getting worn out. This gets us to Operation Balak, 1945, 1946. This is a concerted effort to get guns in from Europe. And they would not be legal, not necessarily, not according to the UN. And this is where a lot of the original German-produced Carabiner 98Ks and 8mm get into the country, as well as anything else. However, Israel, the Israeli area, again, there's all this talk in the UN. What's funny, at this point, the British, and therefore the Americans, are kind of allied with Egypt, Syria, Jordan. This leaves Stalin, communist USSR, to think, hey, maybe we should back an independent Israeli state in the Middle East to check Western power there. So in 1947, it looks like the Russians might be backing Israel. And this is actually how these Czech guns come in. Czechoslovakia is increasingly falling under the sway of the Soviets, and essentially Stalin tells them, send ammunition and send guns down to the Israelis, even if it's technically against the embargo. So in 1948, the initial contract for around 5,000 so-called P-18s are sent. These are Bruno or Brun-made guns from Czechoslovakia. Some are newly assembled from older parts. Some are repurposed World War II Mausers, just, hodgepodge. And throughout that year, 1948, they will send several batches. Total of around 34,000, give or take, this, that, and the other. And again, in the beginning, when they start delivering them around March, April, this is illegal. But in May, the British peacekeeping forces withdraw, and the young state of Israel is first formed. And from the Haganah, we'll first get the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF. This rifle here is, of course, not an 8mm anymore. 7.62, and it's actually in a beechwood stock that's unique, even though other features like the large trigger guard are very Czechoslovakian. So they would get those guns. They would also get a handful of guns from Sweden in a really weird 8x63 cartridge. But in 1949, an important step is taken. They obtained some leftover Ethiopian contract M24 30s. This is important because these are made by FNH, Fabrik National Herstal. These are the first large quantities of FN-made Mausers that the Israelis see. And they like them. Now, at the same time, they want to standardize on this weapon in 8mm. They also obtained some MG34s and MG42s from the Czech-Soviet connection. And so they want to standardize on 8mm. And they even obtained essentially a complete Mauser production line. And they did tool up and try making some experimental guns. This is important for later, I promise. But they quickly discovered it just wasn't economical. Not with so many surplus guns on the market, not with so many experienced makers out there. Instead, they turned to FN around 1950. And they actually come to an agreement to build quite a large number, several thousands, of FN K98 style Mausers for Israel. And these would be official and legal. And one of the last large, all-new production Mauser contracts, they would be delivered all the way through 1953 and they'd still be an 8mm Mauser at the time. I once had an FN made one. They had the Israeli crest on them. They were made for Israel. And this is important because it shows that Belgium is not one of the nations who won't allow dealing with Israel. Even after Israeli independence, it's a bit of a hot button subject, and so a lot of nations are reluctant to deal with Israel, especially selling them small arms, because there's ongoing conflicts with Egypt and other Arab neighbors. There would eventually be an uneasy peace, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. So the Mauser here would be kind of Israel's first de facto infantry rifle, but they have a large range of used guns, new production. Most are in 8x57, but some are in other calibers. By the way, the Israelis never really bothered much scrubbing off the Waffen amps. If anything, they probably got some secret glee in doing that. So usually if you see a pinged out one of these, it was done by an importer or a third-party nation, as these were surplused around the world. So that is the initial connection between Israel and FN Herstal. Aside from just showing off one of my favorite Mausers, I wanted to mention that. However, in the 1950s, the Israelis are looking to jump ahead. They're in a conflict-heavy area. They know there will be war again. They need weapons for their IDF, and they want to jump forward from both actions. They want to replace their infields, even some Carcanos, not to mention the Mausers they have. Still, let's standardize on one. And at this time, the early 50s, they don't have a lot of options, at least not for new production. The U.S. is really not making new M1 Grands by 1949, 1950. Yes, they would start production up again with the Korean War, but they actually sold off their production line at Winchester to Italy. That's where we kind of get the BM-59. And while Israel could have maybe obtained some surplus guns, one, the U.S. has been giving them away. France is a good example, like hotcakes. And two, again, the politics of it all. The U.S. isn't 100% sure how deeply they want to side with Israel. Britain never had a self-loading rifle, although they nearly did. And while 1947-48, Stalin was looking upon Israel rather favorably, after their independence, things are cooling. But we have Belgium. Enter the FN Model 1949, or SAFN, SAFN, FN-49. And this is an Egyptian contract in 8mm, and it's actually a good example because the Israelis would see their neighbors with these and even go up against them. And actually the first FN-49 imports to America came around 1958, 1959 by Interarms, which were from Israel, which were captured guns from the Suez conflict in 1956. But this gun has a storied history. It actually goes way back before World War II. In fact, FN had thought about doing a self-loading infantry rifle before World War I, but it didn't come to anything. And Dudnav Saiv was John Browning's understudy, and after Browning passed away, he really took over as their primary designer, even patented a tilting bolt gas piston operating system around 1936, and there were even plans to put this into production around 1938, but then the Germans rolled over Poland. FN decided to scrap R&D and just devote themselves to producing current guns, namely the bolt action, and then of course 1940, surprise, surprise, Belgium steamrolled again and the Nazis capture the FN factory. Saiv first escapes to Portugal and by 1941 makes his way to England. And there, primarily at the Royal Small Arms Factory, Enfield, works on a self-loading rifle based on his 1930 prototypes. That's kind of why I said British didn't have one, but they came close. And there were some experimental models known as the X1 EXP1 or Slim 1, self-loading experimental model 1, and there were plans in 1944 to produce a couple of thousand pre-production. They'd already had a few dozen, maybe 100 experimental types. But while they were a early ancestor of this gun, they had gassing problems, being overgassed. Nothing they couldn't work out, just, little trouble. Plus, by 1944-45, it's clear the war will be coming to an end. It's also clear that Sive will be going home, which he did in September of that year. So nothing really came of the work at Enfield, except he got to tinker with the design a bit more, and he immediately picked it back up when he returned to FN Herstal. That's why by 1946 we have the earliest experimental versions of this. By 47 they have prototypes ready to show off in various full power cartridges. And one of the most important things he did was he introduced a fully adjustable gas system. It's actually under the handguard on this one, plus this quick cutoff valve and cleaning for the short stroke piston. The pre-production kind of late experimental will be known as the FN model 1948, and then the full production, of course, is the 1949 here. They were actually taking orders in 1948. Venezuela would be the first, but Egypt here would be the second, with deliveries in 1949 starting. In Egypt would first order 100. I guess they liked them. Eventually they would end up purchasing over 37,500, with deliveries primarily between 1949 and 1951. And this was a pretty conventional self-loading rifle, fixed 10-round mag, semi-pistol grip stock, overall length of about 43.5 inches, a barrel length of 23.25, so same as the Mauser. No flash hider as such, although a muzzle brake was created for like the DMR versions. It is a threaded barrel, Mauser-style bayonet lug. Sights you're going to see, at least the front sight, very soon, and it does use that tilting bolt system that Sive have been working on since the 30s, and a very familiar short stroke gas piston system, even a very familiar trigger group. Really the more conventional, aside from the stock on this, is the fixed mag. You can remove it for cleaning, of course. Reciprocating charging handle, very cool little dust cover. Neat safety. I love the cocked indicator. It's not a loaded chamber indicator down here, it's just a cocked indicator. This is rightfully called the father or grandfather, some do, of the FN FAL, because it is. Because while FN introduced this to the market, it was always an interim measure. It was meant to kind of draw the third world nations. At this point, 1950, third world's not a derogatory term. It's unaligned nations, which exist everywhere. Yugoslavia is part of it. India is part of it. A lot of South America is part of it. You know, the U.S. and Russia are willing to sell or even give guns, but there are strings attached. Well, Belgium, it's part of UN. In fact, this gun, when it was adopted by the Belgian army, served in Korea in 1951, which gave valuable feedback on the whole system. Yeah, they targeted those nations that just didn't really want to get involved. So they had multiple contracts spanning up to 1956. There was one final one in 1960, and they would build over 176,000. I should point out that nearly 88,000 of those were to Belgium, and they're not importable for the civilian market here because for some weird-ass reason, they were capable of being made to be select fire. Did I mention these were mostly in 30-06? Also 8mm Mauser. Probably the lightest shooting one they had was the Venezuelan 7mm. Yeah, they were willing to really barrel them for whatever cartridge you wanted. Gas system adjustable was neat. But this was just basically to generate money and generate buzz of Sive's design that had been worked on, and it wasn't too radical. So, because Egypt was filming these, you have to imagine that Israel saw them. And this was one of the few brand new self-loading rifles on the market at the time. So you have to imagine they at least considered it. But, kind of wonder if the folks at FN Herstal said, wait a second, we've got something just coming out. If you want to be brand new and cutting edge, check this out. Now we can talk about it. The FAL, or LAR for English speaking, light automatic rifle. Sive began work on this in 1946, right as the 49 was maturing. And the earliest prototypes in 1947 were actually chambered for 8mm Kurs, 7.92 by 33, the MP44's round. But in 1948, the British tested it out and said, hey, we've got this new cartridge, 280 British, we're working on. And everyone agreed that'd be a great fit for this gun. I completely agree, too. The idea was to have something a little more modern and controllable in select fire. Detachable mags were a big deal. So why are these in 7.62 NATO 308? Well, of course, America. They tried one out for the first time around 1950, 1951, and they were working on the 30 light rifle cartridge, the T65, and they basically said, and it was never a formal agreement, but hey, if you rework your gun for a 30 light rifle, we will go with the FAL, because Belgium's offering the Allies, to help liberate them, free licensing. And that gets into the whole T44 versus T48 thing we talked about in the M14 video, so I'm not going to repeat myself. But because this was a little bigger, longer than the 280, we see the FAL kind of stretched out a bit in the receiver for 7.62 by 51, T65 by 1952, 53. Now, FN was first showing this off in kind of an upcoming features by 1951, but they weren't ready for full-scale production and all that until 1953, and really they didn't start delivering these in any numbers to 1954. So it was cutting edge at the time when Israel was shopping around for a new rifle and a new standard cartridge. They would not be the first. There would be the Allied Rifle Committee set up for NATO in 1953 to select a new cartridge, and this is when we'll start to see the T65 round standardized upon officially becoming 7.62 NATO in 1954. And as is famously known, the Canadians were the first to fully officially adopt an FAL variant as the C1, a so-called inch pattern. Although the British were right there too. They were ordering them in Australia, so all around the same time. This, though, is what they would consider a metric pattern. It doesn't have some of the features of that. And Israel would be one of the earliest adopters of it. Obviously, Belgium is interested. They're going to adopt the FAL themselves. It's going ahead. Argentina is an early adopter in 1955. And that same year, Israel selects this version here. This is the light barrel, known in Israel as the Romat, which is basically self-loading rifle. And comparing it to our FN49, the FAL's kind of said it's big and heavy today. It's actually smaller than this. This is about 43.5 inches, 23 and some change barrel, as I said, and just under 10 pounds unloaded. The FAL is nominally lighter, closer to 9.5 pounds, depending on your variant. Has a 21-inch barrel. Note the early style Type A with just a crowned muzzle, but it has the lug. And with that barrel set up, it's about 41.5, 42 inches long, depending on your stock. Israeli guns tend to have slightly shorter stocks, so they're closer to that 41.5. You'll get up to 43 with later devices threaded on, but at this time, so it's a couple inches shorter, little lighter, somewhat shorter barrel, but 21 inches is still good sturdy carbine length, especially for the new 7.62 NATO cartridge, which is not an intermediate round, but it's kind of being pawned off as such to make things work. And this is an interesting blend here. In a lot of ways, this does show its pre-World War II roots, because you have a forged receiver, steel construction. Everything's milled, very few stamped parts, walnut furniture, and detachable mags. It's a very old war, but has some new features too. Some that were just metric and some that were unique to Israel. So let's get into more of what they adopted as the Romat, talk about the accessories, and talk about the heavy barrel big brother. Just think about it. The cartridge this fired was brand new to NATO, and the rifle was really just in that troop trials phase. Canada had a couple of thousand, Britain was doing it too. Israel was on the cutting edge here. And while nations like Argentina did adopt the metric FAL, it would actually take them a number of years to put them in the field. They didn't even start producing them until 1960. Brazil wouldn't come in until 1964 adopting them. And Israel was actually using these in combat, even though they were in small numbers, the next year, 1956, the Suez Crisis. What did they adopt? In a lot of ways, it was an early so-called metric pattern. It had the tall sights, would have been originally the open ear, 200 to 600 meters. Type C stock, although the earliest ones would be Type A and Type B. The difference is basically in the ferrule, the connection there. Steel butt plate. Like I said a minute ago, Israeli stocks tended to be a little shorter. No storage compartment. And no fully rotating swivel on Israeli. And while this one, because it's a rebuild, has a horizontal takedown, originally they would be the vertical. Interestingly, on the selector, notice this tab up here. While some of the light barrels could be select fire, they all had a redone safety with the positioning a little different. The middle would be safe, and then forward would be semi-auto, and then fully up, if it had the selector, would be full auto. So different arrangement. Typically on an FAL, up is safe, middle is semi, and all the way forward is full. And the arm is a different shape too, even without the tab we'll look at in a minute. Originally these would have been on Type 1 receivers. Later production Israelis you'll see on Type 2. They did not adopt the stripper trip top cover from the C1, and the L1A1 never had it either. They had the original just polymer pistol grip. Maybe some early Israelis had wood, but you mostly see this has the later style with the storage compartment for the cleaning kit. Something very important for Israel. The early ones were just hollow. We'll talk about this funky front sight, which is actually cast in a minute. We have the fully adjustable gas system and the 2-position regulator to cut it off, plus disassemble. Fun fact, the Israeli guns, because they're such an early metric pattern, the actual length of the short stroke piston and gas plug are a little different than your later like Type C metric patterns. Just not because they changed it, just because early days. Sling swivels, they typically issued this infield style sling. They pretty much just used whatever they had. Small foot bolt release. And I don't know if the early ones did, but when you think of Israeli mag catches, they're all this kind of with the hole. They're a little bit enlarged with the hole. So that's just the Israeli style catch. Now note the bolt in the window here. No sand cuts. They weren't doing those yet. The British would. The charging handle, though, is unique to Israel. Now, I think the very, very first ones were just standard, but very soon they went to this enlarged style. And yes, I know there is a light barrel and technically a heavy barrel version. But you can press it in to use it as a forward assist if your bolt is sticking because of sand and dust and dirt. You know, The trials that Israel had in 1954-55 couldn't have been trying out a lot because there just weren't a lot of options on the scene quite yet. Keep in mind, the M14 is still the T-44 prototype in America, and pretty early days for it. The Armalite AR-10, it's not even near ready yet. Even guns like the STG-57 have not been officially adopted in Switzerland, although there might have been some early SIG 510 prototypes they could get their hands on, because SIG is Switzerland and nominally neutral, I'm not sure. That would have been one of the few guns. This is not only pre-HKG3, it's really pre-SETME. Yes, I know work was being done on the SETME, but even the Model A, which was not ready for prime time, was not quite out yet in 1954. This is pretty much what they had to go with, aside from just a domestic design. Now, they did have some design capabilities that would become as IMI, Israeli military industry. And they had the Uzi. They had adopted it in 1951 and very quickly got it in the field. Even though it was a submachine gun, they tried using it as what we would think of as an assault rifle, even putting in slightly longer barrels. But they needed something else. Carry handle, original ones would have been wood. What have you. And they have this lugged barrel. Now, not chrome lined, of course. And again, bearer muzzle. Kind of an interesting idea FN had there. And these took what we think of as standard metric magazines. I do think the inch pattern is better. Dimple in the front to lock in, although they do feature, of course, a bolt hold open. And then finally, these handguards. You can look at the early Coke bottle wood handguards that FN tried out on some guns, and they were just they look cool as hell, but they were kind of fragile. And then there was the T-48 style, the C1 style, that would go places. This one is like the Coke bottle style, but they replaced that forward section with wood heat shields, panels here, and then we have wood back here, and then the gas tube is left open, presumably for cooling, and we have these spacer rings. Now, most just have the one. You notice this one's firm, but there's space for two. That's just what it is. So 1 or 2 rings there, so the handguard doesn't collapse in on itself. Relatively short grip, but enough nice and ribbed for your pleasure. Stops in the front. That was a big improvement, I would say, and the Israelis would continue on with it. Again, short stroke piston system, tilting bolt, the FN49. The bolt is essentially the same. It's actually the carrier with its rat tail that's new for the FAL, at least the fixed stock version, going to a recoil spring in the buttstock. That's something the FN49 did not have. Actually, the FN49's recoil system will be revisited later for the paratrooper, but Israel never used those, at least in any numbers of note. So let's talk about this here muzzle and what they did with it. You know, one unique feature for that time was a non-reciprocating charging handle. And we had a last round holdback device with manual release. Very standard today, but not back then. Safety, of course. Triggers on these are fine. And here's a good old tattered Izzy mag pouch. Thought about finding a nicer one for you, but this really shows they just used the gear they had. Sometimes Uzi pouches, sometimes repurposed Brin pouches. Yeah. So, the lug on the barrel and why it's a bare muzzle. Well, here we have Israeli Type A bayonet. Looks pretty standard blade-wise, except these prongs. I've always kind of thought it was interesting how shallow the lug was on these two. It's almost like an inverted Mauser style. Maybe they did it for anti-snag. Get this guy out of here. Very compact fit. actually it's meant to be fired with the bayonet attached, because this acts as a flash hider. These prongs are meant to do that. In addition, it actually moves, and that's meant to not shift the point of aim. The problem with guns, they tend to have a different point if bayonet is or isn't attached. You can often see this with Mausers, the M90, 130, the M44. So this was meant to address that issue, hopefully. Did it work? I don't think all that well, frankly. Not for the complication added for the bayonet, but it's a cool idea. And I think the reason they did this with the flash hider part of the bayonet was the idea was for, transport. You would detach this. So why put your flash hider as part of your bayonet versus on the gun? They're experimenting. I think the idea was it saved a little bit of length for transport. While soldiers were still marching a lot in this era, mechanized warfare is increasingly common, and this was a way to save off a little thing. Heck, maybe they did it because they just thought it was cool. Also, because of that, they were able to have other muzzle attachments, at least in theory, including this here. A rifle grenade launcher. Keep in mind, this has that adjustable gas system with cutoff for using rifle blanks. Slips on. This can be tensioned down, and we have fold-out grenade sights. This is for the AT-52 grenade. Again, this is early days before a lot of NATO standardization. And we'll actually kind of soon see a refinement of this lug system with the West German G1 and all that. And then it's just kind of folds forward here on this daily whopper. You kind of pull it out and forward. So it's just spring tension. Pretty cool device, I think. So that was the reason for the lugs and what they did. And this was increasingly be putting in the field for the CS Crisis, as I said, as a standard infantry weapon. But what about a support weapon for the squad? Enter the Makleon, FALO, F-A-L-O, the 50.42 model, as it would be known later. From the get-go, FN was offering a light barrel and a heavy barrel model, and almost everyone tried these out. Now some, like Britain, while they would get some trials guns, would never adopt them. So that's why there's the L4 Bren. Of course, Australia would go for their own version, the L2A1, and Canada would do the C2, C2A1. And Belgium themselves would adopt a heavy barrel version, and so would Argentina, and so would Israel. But almost everyone else didn't. There's reasons. Now, one of them is this mag here. This is the extended mag for the machine gun version. It does not seem like Israel ever fielded these in any numbers. And part of it was maybe they just weren't ready yet in 1955, most likely. Another part was a lot of militaries that did go with this magazine experienced a weird, second round stoppage issue. This is a very strong spring to load this many rounds of 7.62 NATO. And of course, it does hang down low. So instead, Israel pretty much just stuck with this. The standard 20 rounder seems to be what they use with these. So the difference is really just the barrel. It's still 21 inches. It's just a lot heavier. It does taper at the front. Under the handguards, even heavier. Notice this one still has the FN style front sight. And it has a birdcage flash hider. It seems like the heavy barrel versions were among the first to have a screw-on flash hider. It's actually a two-piece design, and obviously something goes there. Again, meant to be used as a saw or a light machine gun. That would be a bipod. This is a pouch, basically repurposed, I believe, from a Brin, but again, Israel used what they had. And so some of the bipods you'll see on the FALs were like just forged steel welded together. This one's actually very thick sheet steel, maybe a little cheaper, a little lighter. It also has a braided spring for durability, because they were sure about these. As you notice, it is detachable, at least on the Israeli version, held in with one big old screw. And one has to imagine, kind of like with the flash hider on the bayonet we just talked about, even though this is technically a little longer because of on here, that would help for transport. You don't have that flopping about. Now this is pretty much pinned on. The coupler, it's all part of it. The handguards are that same style, just larger. Only one spacer, and what's interesting, because of everything being thicker, this is not a full donut. You can't spin it. It's actually clipped on. It's about 180 degrees. The carry handle faces forward, not back. Note that it's polymer. We'll talk about that in just a second. The originals were wood. It still has the forward assist charging handle. Note the selector here now does not have the tab, so it has all three positions. This is on an M-Bell receiver. These would have been on type 1 or type 2s. This one has the horizontal. Originally it would have been vertical too. One little difference, it's pretty unique to the Israeli version. These have the tall sights. They're also adjustable from 200 to 700 meters instead of 600 on the light rifle. Another thing I find interesting, this doesn't have the Type C style collar here, ferrule. It's more like a Type B. And that seems to be standard for all the heavies. Still non-rotating side-to-side swivel, but we do have a flip-up butt plate. And it's actually a somewhat different pattern to what you'll see on the later Belgian heavies. A little wider with the ribs. And again, no storage compartment inside here either. So that's primarily the differences. A different butt plate, different rear sight, different barrel. Of course, the hardware for the barrel is different, and a kind of a reversed and somewhat heavier carry handle. But same bolt internals, top cover, same small parts. While my Romat has the 2-position only selector, some would have the 3. This would almost always have the 3 in military service. This is, of course, semi-automatic only. And they took the same magazines. And that was the whole point, was they would be parts interchangeable for a unit armor level, still closed bolt and all that, which was kind of their benefit and their detraction. And here the bipod is attached. Very simple. Doesn't really clamp close like on an RPK. It just kind of floats back here about the edge of those metal grills. Squeeze it, deploy it. There you have it. And yeah, Israel would actually obtain quite large numbers of these. In fact, we see more heavy barrel parts kits and rifles in America than we do light barrel. And at first they were pretty good. Both versions were used initially in small numbers. These would still be 100% Belgian guns in 1956 in the Suez Crisis. This is also be where Egypt would capture some Egyptian FN-49s. They would continue to be the frontline weapon into the 6 Days War, 1967, and still be widespread in the Yom Kippur War, October of 1973. Now, both guns here are on semi-automatic receivers. This is an M-Bell, the other one is an SBL. Why no IMI semi-auto imports in the 80s? Well, that's because IMI never manufactured complete FALs. They never had a license to do that or the desire. But they definitely made almost every other component, and that's why we see variations pop up. And since these were fielded for so long, they would be routinely brought in for upgrades and improvements. And they even adopted some of FN's modernizations in the 1960s. But before we get there and talk about the changes, let's revisit an old friend. The Mauser, when Israel really makes it their own. Remember, while they had some used surplus guns, some of the Czech guns and the FN guns entirely were brand new. They're not going to let those go to waste. Plus, they had that production line we mentioned. Even though they never really made many complete guns, just test guns, they had the ability to do things like make barrels. And since they just had adopted 7.62 NATO, let's rebarrel these from 8mm to 10. This is not a unique concept to Israel. Lots of other nations, Chile comes to mind, did the very same thing. So beginning in 1956 and lasting until 1965, they rebarreled tens of thousands of these. This is why you see the mark very obvious on the stock here, so folks won't get mixed up. And this was not a make-work program. This was done for actual use. They would put a block in the magazine for proper feeding of the shorter round. Luckily, the bolt was pretty much good to go. They would strip all the rifles down, repair, refurbish, refinish every part, giving it a phosphate finish, discarding any well-worn parts. Most of them are put in the new stocks. Notice the finger grooves. These would be made of beech wood. You do see a lot of Kriegsmarine features, but they did standardize on a bayonet, so the lugs became very common with these rebuilds. The Israeli bayonet had a ring for the muzzle. I don't know why the Germans never did, and they did not seem to like front sight protectors. They seemed to go away. So yeah, they started redoing these to fire 7.62 NATO 308, and these would see straight frontline combat. Now, they would often be used as like a DMR, kind of a long-range gun, maybe a guard gun, because especially in the late 50s, they surely didn't have enough FALs. But it was a very comprehensive rebuild program, and that's why the Israeli Mauser is, so popular and really a cool import. Heck, they wouldn't surplus most of these out until 1980. Many of them going to South America. Israel would continue purchasing new rifles and components from FN well into the 1960s. I don't know how many FALs they fielded. A number of 60 to 70,000 can be found, but I can't verify that. But it was a significant number, and again, more importantly to history, they really used them, finding their strengths and their weaknesses. Now, IMI would make a lot of components. Some were exact copies of the Belgian, and others were kind of their own take. One of the most noticeable, originally they all had the tall, open-eared front sight base gas block. But IMI introduced this very unique hexagonal closed block, probably to better protect dirt and stuff from getting in. Plus, it is made from a casting, so probably a little cheaper. They would make new barrels, and while the barrel wouldn't really change much on the heavy, still retaining this bird cage and coupler system to the end, on the light, they would adopt the threaded muzzle in the 60s, going to the early version of the combo device. So you'll see some that have the combo device and the lug, although it's not useful. You can't slip the bayonet over. And then later production barrels won't even have the lug. They'll just have the threads with the Belgian-style device on them. And that also means they would switch over to the Type C, the socket bayonet. The carry handle, as I mentioned, the original ones were wood, either one. IMI produced ones went to this polymer, and it's actually just molded directly on the metal. It doesn't rotate. That's pretty unique to them. And as I said, the mag catch with the hole in it is unique to Israel. Scallop trigger guard. They would go to the newer style pistol grip with the storage compartment for the cleaning kit. Magazines would be a big one. You can find Israeli marked mags. We mentioned the horizontal takedown. That was something FN introduced because the vertical one could wear and unlatch. Here's the selector moved to the other positions. And the charging handle. Now this style is often thought of as the heavy barrel style, but I have a theory. I believe as upgrades went on, all the Israeli FALs got this style. One, just to have one part instead of two. Two, why not have a stronger reinforced part? Why have a somewhat flimsier part for the light barrel gun? So it seems like once you see these guns go through refurbishment, they lose that light barrel handle. Replacement wood was also made. All that good stuff. And presumably other small internal parts besides. So they were keeping these maintained definitely through the 1960s into the 70s. What was their ultimate demise? The Romat was very ahead of its time when adopted in 1955. But as I said at the beginning of the video, this is old world craftsmanship. And therefore, it really started to show its age even a decade later as polymers and alloys and stampings started to become more and more the common. And by the 70s, it's undeniable. This is a relatively long and heavy gun. So as Israel would go more and more to mechanized units, this was harder to get in and out of vehicles with. And while I'm not saying they didn't have a handful of folders, they might have, they didn't really issue the para model, either the 50, 61, or 63. So this is as short as it gets, about 41, 42 inches, but of course once they adopted the newer style compensator, we're at 43 inches. And it's still 9.5 pounds, give or take. And this version was usually limited to semi-automatic only. Select fire was kept for the full autos. And while they did some things like the forward assist to try to help with the sand and the dust, and the FAL is a reliable gun. It definitely served well, but it was always made primarily with a European climate in mind. So these had reputations, especially as parts aged, of jam-o-matics in the desert. Now, part of this could be compensated with by very strict cleaning and training of soldiers, but, you know, in extended engagements like the 6 Days War we could see, there was only limited maintenance you can do. Plus, of course, greases and oils attract sand and dust, and the FAL isn't always the biggest fan of being run dry. I mean, who is? So that's where this reputation comes from. Heavy and that. At the same time, Israeli soldiers are starting to go up against the AK. This is particularly true in the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Now, the AK was not perfect. It too could jam in the desert. Yeah, much to popular myth, the AK is not infallible. Heck, even the Uzi submachine gun, while it was very good, could jam and did in the desert. So nothing's foolproof. I mean, you know, hence Arrakis. But they were more dependable than this was. So the AK, especially for special forces, recon units, they have a lot of captured guns. They're starting to issue them as substitute replacements in the early 70s. So that would mean that a lot of these will start being shifted over to reserves. And that's where they would end up in the 80s. What about the Makleon? The standard FAL was a very popular gun, used by dozens upon dozens of nations, 2 million plus made in Belgium alone, 5 million plus worldwide. Of those, very few were the heavy barrel. It was a nice concept, the one-size-fits-all universal parts in the 50s, but it never worked out. You still have a closed bolt system, you still have the same 20-round magazine, but you have a lot more weight. It's not a quick change barrel. It had its uses, but it also had its limitations. It was neither fish nor fowl. It wasn't quite a true light machine gun, but it was a little too big and bulky to be a rifle. Nevertheless, Israel definitely issued these, and combined with the 7.62 cartridge, in some ways that gave them a little bit longer life. Because obviously, in the 70s, the Galil was developed at IMI in 5.56. Yes, there was a bipod, and you could use it as a longer range gun, but as we saw kind of with the M14 versus the M14A1, having a heavier barrel, bipoded gun kind of behind to provide cover fire still had its utility. So while the light barrel was definitely out, there were still limited uses for these. But either way, by the 80s, both models were in the reserves and soon to be surplused out. And that's how we ended up with all of our parts kits and our semi-automatics. And you definitely see more heavy barrels here. We saw a lot of kits. These are very affordable, 20 some odd years ago. Honestly, I think they were sold below scrap steel prices. So all you had to do was add a receiver. Yeah, the barrel threads are a little different, kind of going back to that early adoption thing. But you could modify, and that's what Springfield did here. They modified a Brazilian Imbel Type 3 receiver. Israel never made Type 3 receivers or used them, but semi-automatic. So Springfield took Israeli kits and put them on SAR 48 marked match receivers and sold them. This was a pre-bend gun. That's what you had. Because IMI never made complete guns, and because the FAL was long out of service by 1986-87, yeah, no one in Israel was going to make all new guns like we saw out of Brazil, out of Argentina, heck, even out of Belgium. Well, sorta, kinda. SBL, Stutchner's Brothers Limited. These are Israeli receivers, technically. Okay, I just said IMI never made receivers. Also true. FN, though, sent over incomplete receivers. They also did this with the FN-49 for Egypt. This is why these are legal, because if they'd been 100% completed receivers, they would have had the pocket for the full auto trip and not been allowed even in the 80s. But because they were still unfinished receivers, what SBL did, they took these leftover FN incomplete forgings, finished them out as semi-autos only, hence the ugly kind of rivets for the semi-auto ejector block, and then they were legal. This is also why you see a few different styles of lightning cuts on these. Some of them are very blocky, like Type 3. This one is more of a Type 1, but it has the kind of curvy cut like a Type 2, which actually mates up well with the recoil plate on the lower. Now, there is a debate with these. We know that these were sold by Onyx and Arms Corps. And we definitely know that just stripped Israeli SBL receivers came into the country. I've had them, friends have them. The question, did complete guns come in? Some sources say no. They were receivers. They brought over parts kits. These are definitely used parts. And assembled here by like Arms Corps. And to be fair, Arms Corps did that with M14s. Springfield did it with M1As. The Arms Corps M14s are kind of neat because they were surplus Israeli kits that came over. By the way, Israel used their M14s as kind of DMRs. They found it to be more accurate than their Romats. And I don't blame them. They did try fitting these with 4-power scopes, but because they had to be mounted on the dust cover, you get it. So Not a hater on the M14, I just like the FAL more. But, does it matter? Israeli receiver, originally FN steel, Israeli parts, pre-band, so no 922R to concern about. This is also how Springfield did their BM59s, the best semi-automatic BM59s. They were Beretta receivers put together here. Regardless of who put these together, they're very neat, high-quality guns. And they were very affordable at a time. Now, I was not buying guns in the pre-ban era. I was alive, but a little young. But when I first got into FALs, my first build was an STG-58. But my first kind of exposure to guns was actually through J-Ro's father. And at the time, he was working on a South African build, and he had done a G1 build. But back in the day, brand new from the catalog, he bought an SBL light barrel FAL, which I saw and shot, even borrowed once or twice. Kind of wish I'd had it back then. But the reason he bought it, he liked the history, just like I did. Also, he liked the price. I think he said back then it cost him $600, and at FN was about $1,000. And even like the Brazilians that Springfield imported were just a little bit more, like $700. So, you know, why not? So I just had kind of that long history with this. I picked this one up about 15 years ago from a buddy. And for a long time, you could still get these, even though they were pre-bans, for a lot less than a Belgian. Because, again, they're used parts. They're not going to be serial matching. They're on a semi-automatic receiver. Some people back in the day really hated these SBL receivers. Yeah, whatever. But I thought the history was cool. So they were very underappreciated for a long time, and not really valued a whole lot more than just a parts kit build. So now today that's different. And like I said, DSA thankfully has done some light barrels. They finally got some kits years ago. They even do replica Israeli marked receivers. They do the lugged barrel, which is really neat. And not only do I like this for its Israeli connection and the fact that these were used so heavily for a quarter century, this is my actual only Type A lugged barrel in the collection. Because it was really the only Type A you could get in the pre-ban period. No one else was doing it. This was before the bulk of parts kits came in. The heavies, though, yeah, you could get them. Now, there were some heavy barrel on SBL receivers that Arms Corps sold. I've never owned one of those. But I have had this one for 20 years. I actually found it in a newspaper, back when those were a thing, in a classifieds ad, local to me. And I believe this was my first pre-ban FAL. It was either that or a MBell SAR-48 itself, because those are very common. But no, just like with the BM59s, Springfield took the MBell semi-automatic receivers and used nice condition parts and built them up and sold them as SAR-48 matches. And the problem back then, people just saw these because they were all semi-automatic only. It's just heavier semis. I mean, the bipod was kind of neat, but it was non-adjustable, kind of flopping around. So they weren't all that popular, things considered. A lot of folks back in the day, even with the Belgian imports, said, why do you want the heavy? What does it do? It's not really any more accurate, and that is true. But I ran across this. I think its service history is cool. I've considered putting like a proper DSA marked receiver on it, but because this one is pre-ban, I'm just going to leave her alone. It's the best case for it. And because, you know, parts have wear and tear, I don't mind shooting either of these. And this, to me, represents an early FALO with the bird cage and this style of bipod. So that's kind of where both of my Israelis lump into the collection, is my early guns, because they really were the earliest amongst the metric users of any significance. History and politics aside, I just love the look and feel of these, especially the light barrel. It's just got such a interesting thing going on. And they're very reliable too, very dependable. Thanks to the adjustable gas system, you can shoot almost any 7.62 NATO loadings out of it. hot, light. They're not really fussy. Easy to clean, easy to maintain. FAL kit building was easy to do because there was no welding, no real riveting. It was just fitting of machined parts. And I don't have a problem with cast receivers either. FN went to them if the casting's done right. But the history of these in Israel would end in the 80s. They'd start surplusing the kits and whatnot out through that period. The last kits I remember coming in for a while were the early 2000s, and then a few years ago some more light barrels came in from Israel. They would be replaced by the Galil, but even it itself in Israel wouldn't last all that long in frontline service. Very soon they would go to the AR-15, CAR-15 for economic and political reasons, not just the gun itself. But it's a classic, and I wanted to do a full-length video going into the history of how the FAL came to be, showing off the Izzies. I didn't want to break the light barrel and the heavy up because they're so integral together. They're a unit, as it were. But which size and type do you like best? And what do you think of Israel's very early adoption of the FAL? Again, before about any other option they had. But soon we'll cover some more, kind of moving into the more modern styles. If you could, though, check out our older videos on FALs, and like, share, and subscribe. Like to help us out, check out Patreon. $308 is not inexpensive. With that, this is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.